Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So it's the middle of October as I record this, and long-time subscribers of mine will probably have realised that around about this time of year, I usually make one or two videos about survival horror games. I've reviewed several horror classics in the past such as Silent Hill, Clock Tower 3, Haunting Ground and several others, and it's basically become a sub-series on the channel at this point. I will of course leave a link in the description section to my survival horror playlist for anybody who's interested. For this month in particular I had several games I wanted to check out for the first time, and wasn't sure which one to start with. For whatever reason I wanted to mix things up a bit, and review more of a modern game than I usually review on the channel. Since as those of you who follow this channel will know, I usually tend to stick to retro games. The game we're going to be looking at today is one that actually just saw its 10th anniversary recently. So I guess it's still kind of retro, but whatever. We're going to be looking at Alien Isolation. Released in 2014, yes 2014 was 10 years ago, crazy I know. Developed by Creative Assembly. Before I go any further, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit the like button, since it really helps the channel, and feel free to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. Also a bit about my own history with the game. So as I mentioned before, this is a game that I just played for the first time recently. However, it's actually a game that I've had in my collection for quite a while, and have been meaning to play for some time. So I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys about the Alien movies. They are of course some of the most well-known and popular sci-fi horror films ever made, and they are pretty much universally loved by the internet and pop culture. Well, at least the first two movies. As far as my own experience with the movies, I saw the first one many years ago when I was a young kid, and I remember enjoying it, since back then I was really into movies like Predator, and I'd heard that Alien was somewhat similar. Weirdly though, I haven't actually rewatched it since, I'm not sure why. The second movie, Aliens, which was more of an action movie, is one that I've seen twice now. I saw that one once as a kid right after I watched the first one, and I watched it again last year, when my local cinema re-released it for some reason. That movie is pretty badass and I really enjoyed it. As far as the third and fourth movies go, I've never seen them, though I've heard some pretty negative things about them, so I never really felt the need to see them. I did see Alien Covenant, which was one of the more modern Alien films, back when that one came out, and it was genuinely one of the worst movies I've ever seen, truly awful, at least in my opinion. I have seen the Alien vs Predator films, which most people don't count. The first one I actually like, somewhat ironically. It's kind of a dumb, over-the-top action film with a lot of unintentional humour that I really enjoyed. The second one, however, is an abomination. Again, one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my entire life, even worse than Covenant. So that's basically my whole experience with the Alien movies. So I wouldn't say that I'm a massive, huge fan of the series or anything like that. I'm not as knowledgeable about the lore or the overall universe that it's based on as I am about a lot of other franchises. I just happen to enjoy the first two films. With the success of the movies and the notoriety they gained, it's only natural that there would be a bunch of tie-in games to go along with them. And yeah, there were a lot of them over the years. However, due to the technical limitations of the time, none of these games were ever truly able to capture the tension, atmosphere and survival horror elements of the first movie. The games tended to be more action-based, typically first-person shooters, resembling the second movie a lot more. And some of these games were pretty good, and pretty well liked. However, the franchise took a major L back in 2013, with the release of the notorious Aliens Colonial Marines, which was a colossal failure both critically and commercially. It's a game that was in development for a very long time, and saw several different developers come and go, ultimately being finished by Gearbox Software, who famously did the same thing for Duke Nukem Forever, another game that took over a decade to make, which is a game I love by the way, but I digress. Colonial Marines left a really bad taste in Alien fans' mouths, and they were practically crying out for a game that would redeem the franchise. The following year, Creative Assembly finally gave us a game that could genuinely be considered a survival horror, one meant to capture the overall vibe of the first movie. The game of course had a lot riding on it, and it was basically all or nothing for the franchise. So did the game do that, or was it another misfire? Let's talk about it. Right off the bat, I would say that the game succeeded where it was meant to, and it's certainly a terrifying and atmospheric horror game, but at the same time, it's a game that I do have some mixed feelings on, since as great as the game is, it does have a few technical issues, as well as a few problems from a game design perspective, but we'll get to that later. So the game is of course a first-person shooter / survival horror stealth game based on the Alien movie series. As far as the game's story goes, rather than it being based on any of the movies specifically, it actually takes place in between the first two, more specifically 15 years after the events of Alien. You play as Amanda Ripley, the daughter of Ellen Ripley, who was of course the main protagonist of the series. The game begins with Ripley being informed that her mother's flight recorder has been recovered by the salvage ship Anesidora and is being held in the space station known as Sevastopol. Ripley is offered a place on the retrieval team by an android named Samuels, who wants her to get closure since she never figured out what happened to her mother, and you get the sense that it kind of consumed her life.
I know why you're working in the region where she went missing. You're still looking, aren't you? I've been cleared to offer you a place on the Torrance if you want to come along. Maybe there'll be some closure for you.
You get a useful tutorial where Ripley explores the ship, getting to know the crew and preparing en route to Sevastopol. When arriving at the station, it's clear that something is wrong, and while attempting to spacewalk to the airlock, the crew are hit by an explosion that causes them to be separated.
My God, Ripley. You're doing good, Tim. Just keep moving.
Taylor, Ripley, hold on!
You take control of Ripley and will need to explore Sevastopol and attempt to find the flight recorder as well as regroup with the crew. You find out pretty early on that the station is in turmoil. Many of its inhabitants are either dead or missing, and those who remain are basically frightened to death and running and hiding for their lives, in a constant state of paranoia. You learn that a mysterious alien creature of unknown origin, gee I wonder what, is lurking aboard the station and picking people off one by one. Also, the androids who occupy the station, known as the Working Joes, seem to be malfunctioning and are hostile towards the humans they come across. Basically, the whole station is in lockdown, and Ripley is right in the middle of whatever's going on. Naturally, this makes the game extremely tense, since you're never sure what waits around the corner, and you always feel like you're being watched. Without giving away too much of the game's plot, there are quite a few twists and turns along the way, and the story is actually somewhat interesting, which I think really helps with the horror elements, since it can help to motivate you to see it through to the end and find out what's going on, facing the fear head on. And the game does its bit to help the player to understand Ripley's motivations and relate to her as a character, and I like this. Also, this is one of them games that has plenty of visual storytelling. Pretty much every area of Sevastopol has its own story to tell. You can see the deterioration all around you, and the remnants of what the place used to be. There's graffiti all over the place, as well as warning signs, and the more previously populated parts of the station seem to be more worn and more hazardous than the others. There's also plenty of collectibles around the station that allow you to further indulge yourself in the game's lore. More on that stuff later. Long story short, the game has an interesting enough story to keep you hooked. As far as the overall gameplay goes, as I mentioned before, it's a first-person shooter and stealth game. The vast majority of the game will have you sneaking around, fighting or avoiding enemies, solving puzzles, rescuing NPCs, and generally traversing the station trying to escape. Of course, the main appeal of the game is the xenomorph itself, which is the primary antagonist. The xenomorph stalks you for the entire game, and will often show up when you least expect it, even in areas where you aren't given any indication that it's even there. This is where the game shows off both its horror and stealth elements, as well as its AI, which is pretty sophisticated for sure. A lot of the stealth mechanics in the game are noise related, meaning you will have to crouch and move quietly for most of the game, sneaking around, hiding behind barriers, underneath ledges, and inside of cupboards and lockers, staying out of the line of sight of the alien, trying to sneak past it or give it the slip, as well as remaining as quiet as possible, so as not to garner its attention. As the game progresses, this will get more and more complicated, and more challenging, and like all the best stealth games, it's surprisingly intellectually stimulating, not to mention absolutely nerve-wracking. It's a game that actually takes a lot of skill to play, as well as a lot of patience, and a genuine understanding of the stealth mechanics, something that a lot of players don't really have the time for, since there are very few exploits, and the AI, particularly for the alien, is pretty solid, at least for the most part. It did bug out here and there, again more on that later. I have to say that the xenomorph in the game is genuinely terrifying, and one of the scariest horror game antagonists I've ever come across. Basically in the early part of the game, you're forced to rely purely on stealth, since you have no way to fight the alien, and it kills you in one hit. Some of the death animations are pretty scary also. Sometimes you won't even see it coming. In addition to sneaking, you can also distract the alien by making noises and activating machines, and occasionally this can help you to escape. There are also throwing items that can be used to accomplish this. In a way, the game reminded me of something like Haunting Ground, since the alien would get wise to some of your tactics and would make adjustments, making it much less predictable and more dangerous, leading to a lot of trial and error. I mentioned before that in the early part of the game you will have no way to fight the alien. What's terrifying about this too is that when traversing the areas of the game that don't typically have you encounter the alien directly, you will still have to be very careful because it will still sometimes show up if you make too much noise. For example, you may be exploring an area and sneaking around, avoiding other enemies, or completing other objectives, only for something to suddenly grab you from above. The alien will sneak around in vents, and if you hear a creepy noise above you, or below you, then chances are it's there and watching, setting a trap for you. As you play through the game, you will figure out ways to avoid this. Be sure to avoid walking under open vents and watch out for dripping slime. Also listen out for strange noises, being careful every step of the way, even when completing puzzles or objectives or dealing with some of the other enemies in the game. Speaking of, in addition to the alien, there are other enemies aboard the station that you will come across from time to time. These are human enemies from various factions. These are basically paranoid and will shoot Ripley on sight in most cases out of fear. So yeah, it's best to keep your distance from them. And the more common and more annoying enemies in the game are the Working Joes, these defective androids who patrol the station and beat the absolute piss out of people for no reason.
Can I help you?
I need to get into comms control. It's urgent.
That is a restricted area.
It's an emergency. Don't you realize what's going on?
Apollo has the situation in hand.
The Working Joes are actually pretty scary in their own right, particularly when they corner you and try to choke you out. Just like with the alien, it's often wiser to simply use stealth and distractions to avoid these enemies, since it's wise to conserve both your health and ammo. Since both are of course in short supply, with this being a survival horror game. Be sure to save every bullet you find, since you never know when you might need it. Late in the game you also take on facehuggers, which are extremely annoying, since they kill you in one hit, so you have to be very fast to defeat them. Oh, and if you don't have the flamethrower, you're screwed. So yeah, long story short, the game has other enemies besides the alien. Also, as the game goes on, you will come across various weapons, such as guns, melee weapons, and throwing weapons, some of which can be used in specific situations. Some of these can also be used to unlock doors and activate machines. The first melee weapon you get is a maintenance jack. This can be used to break open locks on certain doors, and can even be used to bash enemies. You also get a stun baton, which serves a similar function in combat. Personally, I barely ever used these since I tended to stick to stealth in most situations. In fact, in my entire playthrough, I don't think I successfully used the stun baton once. I did use some of the other weapons though and made good use of them. As far as guns go, you get a revolver, which is pretty crappy if truth be told, since Ripley is a pretty poor shot. And this is done on purpose to make the game more immersive and more scary, and it makes sense since Ripley isn't a soldier. Basically the revolver is only practical against human enemies, since against the Working Joes, it takes like 3 or 4 headshots to bring them down sometimes, and you have to be pretty accurate. And as I mentioned before, Ripley is a pretty crappy shot. Translation, I'm a crappy shot, and I'm just blaming it on Ripley. So this causes you to waste ammo like crazy, and it's very annoying. Seriously, I hated those Working Joes and I wanted to demolish a lot of them, pain in the ass enemies. You also get a shotgun, which is pretty badass. Makes short work of both humans and those stupid androids, without wasting too much ammo.
Come with me, please.
Seriously, the shotgun is awesome. And you also get a bolt gun, which while quite powerful, is a pain in the ass because it's one of those guns that needs to be charged up to fire, which is lame. And most importantly, you get a flamethrower. The flamethrower is everything in this game. It's your best friend. Perhaps the only thing you'll ever truly love. Stick to the flamethrower and conserve its ammo as much as possible, particularly since not only can it be used against most enemies, but it can even be used to temporarily ward off the xenomorph, which of course gives you a lifeline. Though interestingly, with the AI of this game being so impressive, the xenomorph will actually get wise to this, and start trying to outmaneuver your attacks, coming in at angles and sneaking up on you. Very scary. But yeah, long story short, the flamethrower is very important in this game, and as I mentioned before, it's the only way to practically defeat facehuggers. In addition to the guns and melee weapons, you can also find and craft explosives, as well as other useful items. For example, there are several bombs in the game, such as pipe bombs, flashbangs, smoke grenades, and even Molotovs. These are all few and far between, so use them sparingly, you never know when you might need them. In addition to these, there are also items that can be used to create noise to distract enemies, such as the appropriately named Noisemaker. This can actually be used to summon the alien, which can be strategically directed towards enemies to take them out for you. Yeah, you can actually summon the alien to take out enemies for you, which is just as hilarious as it sounds. Funnily enough, you don't always need to do this, since sometimes if an enemy shoots at you from a distance, then the alien will hear the shots and just randomly show up and save your life, which is pretty ironic. You can also use flares, which I barely ever use since I didn't really find much of a use for them, and you can of course also get medkits, which can heal you. All of these items, as I mentioned before, can either be found scattered around the game by either picking them up or looting bodies or containers, or they can simply be crafted. The game's crafting system is thankfully pretty straightforward. Before crafting an item, however, you will need to find and obtain a blueprint. These are usually very easy to find, so I wouldn't worry too much about missing them. Simply pick up the blueprint for a particular item or upgrade and you can craft it as long as you have the necessary ingredients. You simply gather ingredients from around the game and use them to quickly craft items from the menu, very easy to learn and not too time consuming. In addition to the combat, stealth and survival aspects, as I mentioned before, the game also has plenty of puzzle solving. You will often have to navigate dark areas, crawling around in vents, using your flashlight to see where you're going. Just be careful not to attract enemies with the flashlight, of course. And be sure not to run out of battery. There's plenty of batteries you can find around the game. And figuring out ways to complete objectives. You will have to find several upgrades for several tools to help you overcome the obstacles, such as an ion torch to burn through locked panels, and a hacking device to hack and unlock terminals. There will also occasionally be security cameras to avoid. Get caught by these and they will sound an alarm to alert nearby enemies. You can usually disable these by hacking into a rewire system. There are loads of these in the game and they serve several useful functions. You get a few minigames to interact with which are pretty easy if truth be told, and for me this is where some of the issues with the game start to surface. I don't have a problem with these minigames per se. The issue is that they repeat way too often for my liking, and towards the end of the game they just become tedious. For example, there's a huge portion of the game where the alien gets locked away somewhere, and Ripley will be tasked with sneaking around, activating generators, deactivating generators, obtaining keycards, passcodes, and generally just faffing about, and over time it starts to get a bit boring. It seemed like the developers thought, okay, the player has had enough horror, enough stealth and enough action, and enough survival mechanics. Let's have them spend a few hours faffing about, repeating the same minigames over and over. For me it pretty much ruined the overall pacing of the game, and it felt to me like there was a lot of unnecessary backtracking. Also, and this may just be me being a bit of a dumbass, but I got lost several times during these sections, and I felt like the game's waypoints were deliberately misleading me, for the sake of padding out the game's runtime. This is of course entirely subjective and just my personal opinion, but I felt like a lot of these sections could have been trimmed down, or replaced with more NPC interactions or stealth. I get that the game is called Isolation and it's meant to make you feel claustrophobic and lost, but the point still stands. Also, I mentioned before that the game does have some minor technical issues. I ran into some frame rate issues here and there, and occasionally the game's AI would bug out, despite usually being solid. Sometimes the working Joes would see me when there's no way they possibly could, or wouldn't see me when I'm right in front of them. Kinda reminded me of Manhunt in that sense, though nowhere near as bad. Sometimes I would even run into a glitch that would cause me to need to reload from a previous save. For example, in one section of the game, I needed to talk to a particular NPC, and he just stood there and said nothing. I had to reload, and it worked fine on my second try. Also, there was a particular moment in the game where I needed to loot a working Joe's body to pick up a keycard, and the keycard wouldn't spawn in, meaning I had to once again reload a save. A quick Google search reveals people having the same problem I had there, so yeah, that's another slight technical issue I ran into. Oh, and I would occasionally see guns floating in the air. There were also a few very annoying difficulty spikes later in the game, which were definitely used as padding in my opinion, since these were pure trial and error. Also, the game's ending was a bit anticlimactic in my opinion. It just sort of ends suddenly without any sort of satisfying conclusion to speak of. Extremely disappointing in my opinion. All in all, these are pretty minor issues, but as a guy who's played many survival horror games over the years, as well as many stealth games, these issues are very noticeable to me. It's a shame because in my opinion, if the pacing was better, and the minigames and puzzles were a bit less repetitive, as well as the game having less backtracking, and with the AI and general technicalities being a little bit more polished, then this could have been one of the greatest survival horror games of all time. But for me, there's just a few issues that hold it back, and I think my score has to reflect that. I mentioned before that the game has collectibles. There are plenty of them. In addition to weapons, ammo and items, you can also find ID tags scattered around the game that belong to some of the missing people on board, as well as updates for your map. This can of course be very useful helping you to navigate the game. There are also audio recordings which you can find and listen to find out more about the game's story and the events leading up to it.
Flawed. It had its back to me, walking down a corridor like it was the most natural thing in the world. I hid, but when I looked up it wasn't there. I think it went into the floor, maybe the ceiling. Sevastopol's a maze. Could be living anywhere. This must be what the marshals have been chasing. This shouldn't have been kept from me. Chief out.
There are also plenty of terminals for you to read, and further indulge yourself in the game's lore, which is pretty interesting. The game does also attempt to spice up the gameplay a bit by having you change into a spacesuit and do some tasks on the exterior of the station. And you even get a flashback mission at one point, which is quite interesting. I suppose if nothing else, these sections do their bit to add some much needed variety to the game. Lastly, aside from the main campaign, the game also has a survival mode, which is basically a challenge mode. You can try out if you want to. It is what it is. All in all, the game is very atmospheric. As far as the overall graphics and presentation go, I think the game looks fine. Some of the character models do look a bit strange, but the main ones are all fine, and the pre-rendered cutscenes look great. I think it's a great looking game in general. And it of course has a pretty good soundtrack, as well as very good sound design in general, which of course all adds to the atmosphere. So yeah, that pretty much sums up my overall thoughts on Alien Isolation. All in all, it's a great survival horror game that succeeded where it most needed to, but for me, there were just a few things about it that held it back from being one of the best. I'd say I give the game a solid and well-deserved 7 out of 10, which I think is a fair score given my criticisms. It's not my favourite survival horror game, not even close. I'd say I preferred Haunting Ground and Clock Tower 3 slightly over this, as well as Silent Hill 1 and 2. I'd put this game on par with something like Resident Evil 7 in terms of how much I enjoyed it. Still a great survival horror game for what it's worth, and I would certainly recommend it if you're into that sort of thing. If you're a fan of the Alien series, then you'd probably have a blast with this game. Thanks for watching guys, I really enjoyed playing and reviewing Alien Isolation. Once again, if you could smash the like button, I'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Let me know what you guys think. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.